The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse felt heavy, almost suffocating. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, whispering among themselves, waiting for what seemed like an open and shut case. At the defendant's table, a young man stood, his hands casually tucked in his pockets. His chin was lifted just enough to show that he wasn't afraid. His name? Jalen Dawson. His charges? Grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Across from him, Judge Walter Grayson peered down over his glasses. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. He saw nothing more than a clueless teenager standing before him, a kid with no real defense. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This isn't a debate club, kid." The courtroom chuckled. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. But Jalen wasn't laughing, because what the judge didn't know, this clueless teen was about to turn the courtroom upside down. Jalen had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head. His mother, Denise Dawson, had worked as a paralegal for 20 years, and Jalen grew up listening to courtroom stories. He knew how prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, and how some defense attorneys barely tried. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. Judge Grayson sighed, flipping through the case file. "Let's make this quick. I have a golf game at 2. The audience chuckled again, but this time, Jalen smirked, because Grayson had just made his first mistake. But no one had noticed yet. Mitchell Carrington, the state prosecutor, rose from his seat with the air of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie was perfectly knotted, and his voice carried that rehearsed confidence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The words landed with weight. The crowd in the gallery murmured. On the surface, the case seemed clear-cut. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen, his expression smug. "Go on," Carrington continued, pacing confidently. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." Then, locking eyes with Jalen, he added, "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Carrington flipped through his papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Judge Grayson nodded. "Sounds straightforward to me." And for most people in the room, it did. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest, case closed, right? But Jalen had studied too many trials not to see the cracks. Still, he waited, watching. Then, finally, the judge turned to the defense attorney. Lisa Thornton, a public defender, shifted nervously before standing. "Your Honor, my client..." Jalen placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went completely silent. Judge Grayson squinted at him. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even the bailiff looked shocked. Carrington let out a sharp laugh. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. For the first time that morning, no one was laughing. Jalen Dawson, just 19 years old, had just announced that he would be defending himself in court. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his amusement flickering into mild curiosity. "You sure about this, kid?" Jalen nodded. "Very sure, Your Honor." The gallery was buzzing now, spectators whispering, exchanging glances. The bailiff stole a glance at the prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, who smirked. "All right then," Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Let's hear your defense." Jalen stepped forward, his hands still casually in his pockets. "Before I begin, Your Honor, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington rolled his eyes, crossing his arms. "Go ahead." Jalen took a slow step forward. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington nodded sharply. "That's right." Etapates bisendes bibor. Jalen's eyes didn't waver. "And that testimony is written in his official report?" Carrington scoffed. "Of course it is." Jalen turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." The courtroom went dead silent. Grayson squinted at him. "On what grounds?" Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured to the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. "What?" Jalen took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, but I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Grayson frowned and turned to Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Jalen gave a small shrug, his voice calm. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it." Judge Grayson studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any objections to verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated, and in that moment, the jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed. A beat of silence. Then finally, Carrington shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. Carrington shuffled through his notes, his polished confidence starting to crack. But he wasn't ready to lose control just yet. "Your Honor," he said, forcing his voice back to steady, "while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "That's true." Carrington straightened, regaining some of his footing. "So, regardless of the officer's statement," Jalen cut him off. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. Jalen turned to the jury, making eye contact with each one of them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling." He took a deep breath, his tone staying calm, controlled. "Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. "I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked." He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to regain control. Jalen wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done." He turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who examined the fingerprints subpoenaed to testify today?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard. He glanced at Carrington. Carrington hesitated. Then, reluctantly, "No." Jalen pressed his lips together, shaking his head. "So, let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Carrington stiffened. Jalen nodded as if that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting." Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. It was the look of a man realizing this case was not the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Jalen wasn't done yet, because the next thing he was about to say, it would change everything. The tension in the Los Angeles County Courthouse was unbearable. The judge, the jury, and the entire audience were hanging on to Jalen's every word. No one was laughing anymore. No one was smirking. Even Prosecutor Carrington, who had entered this courtroom so sure of an easy conviction, was now gripping his notes like a lifeline. But Jalen wasn't done yet. He turned slowly back to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Grayson frowned. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, gave a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never included in the prosecution's case files." Carrington froze. Jalen took out a printed transcript, held it up, and began reading aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." Gasps filled the courtroom. Jalen lifted the paper higher. "This is from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently ignored. The same report the arresting officers conveniently forgot to mention." Judge Grayson's jaw tightened. He turned sharply to Carrington. "Counselor, is this accurate?" Carrington hesitated. The pause was just long enough, and everyone in that room knew the answer before he even opened his mouth. "Your Honor," Carrington started, his voice faltering. Jalen cut him off. "The arresting officer deliberately omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?" The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Grayson let out a long, slow exhale, rubbing his temple. The case was falling apart, fast, and Jalen had just delivered the final blow. The silence was deafening. Jalen turned to the jury, his voice steady, controlled. "The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough." He let the words sink in. "That's what this case is really about." The jury members exchanged uneasy glances. The bailiff clenched his jaw. Even Judge Grayson, who had spent the entire trial mocking Jalen, now looked unsettled. Because this wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about the system itself. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, then finally spoke. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington sat stiffly, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Silence. Then, finally, Judge Grayson leaned forward, and in a tone completely different from the one he had used at the start of this trial, he spoke the words that no one in that courtroom expected to hear. "Case dismissed." Half the courtroom erupted in disbelief, some in relief, some in anger. Jalen stood completely still, letting the moment sink in. Judge Grayson gripped his gavel tightly, staring at Jalen with an expression no one could quite read. For the first time in his long career, Grayson realized he had underestimated the wrong person. Jalen turned to leave, heading toward the exit, but just as he reached the door, "Mr. Dawson." Jalen stopped. He didn't turn around, just waited. Judge Grayson hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "You should consider law school." Jalen smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. The moment Jalen Dawson stepped out of the Los Angeles County Courthouse, he was met with a wall of flashing cameras and booming voices. "Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Microphones were thrust in his face, cameras zoomed in, and headlines were already being typed. But Jalen? He just pulled his hoodie over his head. He wasn't here for the spectacle. He wasn't interested in being a social media sensation. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. She had been watching the entire trial, watching as her son, her baby boy, defended himself against an entire system designed to break him. She folded her arms, her face unreadable. Jalen paused. "Hey, Ma." Denise shook her head, letting out a slow breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Had to take a risk, Ma." Denise just stared at him. Then, finally, she pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The reporters kept shouting questions, the cameras kept rolling, but at that moment, none of it mattered. Judge Walter Grayson stood next to his car. His usual arrogant posture was gone. His expression wasn't mocking anymore. It was something else, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, just another defendant, just another guilty plea. But now he knew he'd remember this one. Because Jalen had done something most people never could. He had made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. He had won his case. He had exposed the cracks in the justice system. But that victory didn't sit right with him. Because for every Jalen Dawson, there were 1,000 others who didn't have his knowledge, his confidence, his ability to fight back. And that thought haunted him. How many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted, not because of evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? Denise poured herself a cup of coffee, studying her son. "You're not done, are you?" Jalen shook his head. "Not even close." Denise leaned forward. "Then what's next?" He ran his fingers over them, deep in thought. Jalen had already made up his mind. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. Because this wasn't just about one case. This was about all of them, and he was just getting started. Here's the real question. How many other people have been convicted, not because they were guilty, but because the system failed them? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back, but what about the ones who don't? This wasn't just a case. It was a wake-up call. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change, but only if we make them. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter. Let's keep the conversation going, because next time, it might not be Jalen, it might be someone you know,